Let me briefly introduce the panel, and then we'll get right to it. We are joined today by John Shea, who is the author with Willie Mays of a book called 24, Life Stories and Lessons from the Say Hey Kid. We're also joined by Jon Pessah, who is the author of Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask. Mitchell Nathanson is with us. He is the author of Bouton, The Life of a Baseball Original. Dale Tafoya is here to talk about his book, Billy Ball, Billy Martin and the Resurrection of the Oakland A's. And finally, Jason Turbow, who is here to talk about They Bled Blue, Fernandomania, Strike Season Mayhem, and the weirdest championship baseball ever had seen. The weirdest championship until this year, at least. I think if we do get a 60-game season, the championship of 2020 may end up being the weirdest championship ever. But for the time being, we'll say 1981 was the weirdest championship. So we're here today to talk about icons and iconoclasts. So John Shea, I want to start with you because there's nobody more iconic in baseball than Willie Mays. And of course, you wrote this book with Willie. I've kind of had this obsession for the last couple of years of this idea that baseball in the 21st century no longer produces celebrities. And I want to talk about that a little bit in relation to the guys we are going to talk about today who all were, celebrities in some way outside the world of baseball. And certainly Willie Mays is a guy who became a star from almost the minute he became a Major League Baseball player, and is so iconic now that you were able to talk to 3 presidents about him for your book. You were able to talk to all sorts of former major leaguers about him. He's a guy who everybody loves and respects. He's famous. He may be more famous than any current Major League Baseball player. I mean, Mike Trout is a great player, but I saw a recent survey, less than half of Americans even know who he is. So, John, what I wanted to ask you first of all is just talk about why Willie Mays became so iconic. Beyond the fact that he was a great player, why did the fans take to him so much? And why do they still take to him? And why do you think we're not seeing that with current Major League Baseball players like Mike Trout?
Well, thank you. No, Willie Mays, we all know the 5 tools. We all know what he did between the lines. But what set him apart and what maybe glamorized him, among fans, even at Ebbets Field, even at Dodger Stadium, where he just wasn't booed, was what he did to entertain people, what he did with his 6th tool. He never came out of games. He played 150 games, 13 straight years, which is a record that will never be broken. Cal Ripken didn't even do that. 13 straight years, 150 plus games. So he had it all, but he had more than just the 5 tools. He anticipated you, out thought you, out. He did everything to beat you beyond the tools. Plus, he brought everybody into the house. The Giants had not great attendance at Candlestick Park, as we all know, but throughout the 60s, they had the best road attendance than any other team. And you talk to all of those great Hall of Famers, and there were many of them, they all say it was because of Mays. So there was a lot more to it than being a ball player. He was an icon. He was a cultural icon. He was a hero, and not just a baseball hero, not just a sports hero, but an American hero.
And just to follow up on that a little bit, why do you think we're not seeing that? I mean, Willie Mays is obviously up there among the greats, but even in the 70s and 80s, you had players like you mentioned Cal Ripken, certainly Derek Jeter, who became famous outside the world of baseball. Why don't we see that anymore?
You talk about today's players who do their share of celebrating, but they do it after hitting the home run. They do it after making a diving catch. Mays seemed to celebrate the game while the play was still going on, whether it was the basket catch or the fact that he told me in the book, I made hard plays look easy and easy plays look hard. I mean, who would do that? I said, why you do that, Willie? Because he said, I want to bring these guys back tomorrow. I want them to think that, nothing that they had ever seen before today, they saw me do today. So it was much more than that because, he brought them to the game. And, I think we're seeing that celebratory manner with today's players. But I think Willie celebrated in the moment before he did something well.
You mentioned in the book also that one of the reasons he viewed himself as an entertainer was because he started his career in the Negro Leagues with the Birmingham Black Barons. You talked about that a little bit, about how that experience of playing in a league where they really did have to entertain the fans to get people in to watch them, how that impacted his major league career.
And yeah, I asked him when he started being an entertainer, because I thought it was the military, where he was called in during the Korean War to entertain the troops, along with Whitey Ford and Johnny Antonelli and Don Newcomb and so many other ball players who didn't fight, like Ted Williams or Jerry Coleman, but they were called in to entertain and play ball. So they continued to hone their skills. But yeah, I mean, he says it was all the way back to high school, before the Negro Leagues. He had that thing about him, as Joey Malfitano says, it was an it factor that Willie had. And he had it in Willie's mind his whole life, because that's what he did in high school. He played in the Negro Leagues in high school. His high school in Fairfield, Alabama, didn't even have a baseball team. They had a basketball team, football team. He was a superstar on both those. And baseball was his third sport, and they didn't have a team. But who cares? He played in the Negro Leagues with the great Birmingham Black Barons. And not until he graduated from high school did he sign with the Giants, and he went from an all-black league to an all-white league, which was an amazing culture shock that he overcame and fought through. And you know, fortunately, he didn't let the bigots win or the racists win, and he is the Willie Mays that we know today.
One of the things that's really interesting about this panel, and Jason and I talked about this a little bit earlier, is that there's a lot of overlap between these particular players. For, you know, Willie and Yogi Berra were great stars in New York in the 50s. Billy Martin played in New York in the 50s and later, of course, managed in New York. And Jim Bouton was on the Yankees at the end of Yogi Berra's career. So there's a lot of overlap between these various players. So Jon Pessah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about this, because Willie Mays famously ended his career with the Mets in 1973 on the You Gotta Believe team that made the World Series. The manager of that team, of course, was Yogi Berra, a guy who had been a great player along with Willie Mays, but had retired by that point as a player. Talk a little bit about the relationship between Yogi and Willie. Did they get along? What kind of relationship did those two icons have when they were in the same clubhouse in 1973? Is Jon Pessah here?
I'm still muted. Can you hear me now?
Okay, yeah, we can hear you, John.
Oh, great.
Did you hear my question?
Yes, I did. Yogi did not want Willie Mays on the Mets. And he made that very clear to the general manager, who actually, Bob Sheffing, who backed him on that. But Willie was Joan Payson's favorite player. And when the Giants, who were not all that unhappy to part ways with Willie, got the offer from the Mets, they jumped at it. Sheffing sat down with Willie and said, "You need to understand that Yogi is the manager of this team, and it's his rules, or this isn't going to work." And right at the beginning, I mean, you got to remember too that Yogi had gone through this with Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford, two of his close friends who were not exactly great helps in '64 in keeping him employed. And to bring in a 42-year-old legend past his prime, who set his own rules at the end of his tenure with the Giants, was something that Yogi did not want. They had a little bit of a rocky start, but actually Yogi had more problems than Willie, and Willie pretty much towed the line, and it was Cleon Jones who ended up being Yogi's biggest headache and eventually his undoing with the Mets.
Now, Yogi was obviously, we think of him as an icon now. And in his time, he was teammates with, you mentioned Mickey Mantle, of course, the big star. He was playing in the same city as Jackie Robinson, as Willie Mays for a time. What was he an icon when he was playing, or is that something that happened, in his later years when we started doing, talking about the Yogi-isms, and he kind of took on this caricature? Was he always such an icon in New York and in baseball?
Well, I got to tell you, one of the reasons I did this book was Berra was my father's favorite player. My father was a catcher. I became a catcher for the same reason. And he told me about an incredibly dynamic player that basically dominated the American League. And I didn't catch up to Yogi until 1960 when I was 8 years old. And I saw a very good role-playing outfielder. So I didn't get to see the player that my father saw. When I went back and I looked at each season and how much he dominated, and he was the best player on the best team in baseball history. From 1949 to 1953, the Yankees win 5 straight World Series. People think that it went from DiMaggio to Mantle. If you were alive and well, and certainly in New York in the 1950s, you understood that it went from DiMaggio, who overlapped for 3 years. 1 year, half a year he was out. His final year, he batted .263. The best player on that team was Yogi Berra. Beginning of the Mickey Mantle era was mostly strikeouts and being booed by the fans. And Berra won three MVPs, finished second twice, third once, and fourth once. He was the third highest player in baseball pretty much throughout the 50s. So I think he was an icon in the 50s, and especially, I mean, New York was, you know, I wish I was a little older at that point, because New York was the center of the universe. You had 16 teams, and 3 of them played in New York. And one of them, or if not 2, were always in the World Series. 17 full seasons with the Yankees, 14 World Series. Yeah, Yogi was an icon during his playing days, without a doubt. And the interesting thing is his persona, that's what absolutely overwhelms how great of a player he was, because he was just such a character and was portrayed as such a character by the media.
Mitchell Nathanson, I want to bring you in here for a minute. We just talked about Yogi Berra and how his career from the late 40s to the early 60s really coincides with the greatest era in Yankee history. And then Jim Bouton comes in right at the end of that era. I think he and Yogi overlapped for a couple of seasons, I believe, right at the end, 62, 63 maybe. You know, if Willie Mays is the ultimate baseball icon, Jim Bouton maybe is the ultimate baseball iconoclast. What did Jim Bouton think about the icons of the Yankees in that era, the Yogi Berras, the Mickey Mantles? We know he wrote about Mantle quite a bit in Ball 4, but what did he think about somebody like Yogi Berra? Did he take the idea of being an icon seriously, or was it something he was cynical about?
Well, he liked Yogi, you know, but I don't think, you know, he liked Yogi, but he didn't respect him. And he said that, at least he told me, that while the players all liked him, nobody respected him because of his reputation of being, you know, old. He's always going to be good old Yogi. And so when he became the manager in '64, you know, he started with, he became a bit of a hard ass, Yogi, to get some respect. And the players didn't really take to that. But I don't think, I mean, Bouton liked Mantle. He liked Berra. I didn't talk to him about Mays, so I don't know what he felt about Willie Mays. But, you know, he liked those guys personally. I don't think he was a fan of the pedestals that they were placed on. And I know that he thought that Yogi was a fictional character. You know, the guy that he knew in the locker room was not the guy that you would read about in the newspaper. There were 2 different people. And at least that's what he thought. And he said that, you know, he liked the guy in the locker room. He was a good guy, but, you know, as an icon, I don't think Bouton saw anybody as an icon. But he did like him personally, for whatever that was worth. I think when people try to build them up too much, I think that's when Bouton would kind of bite back a little bit and try to knock them down to size. And I think when Berra became the manager, that was a problem between him and Bouton. And Berra had a problem with a lot of people when he was a manager that he didn't have before.
I'm sorry, we didn't get the last part of that. What did he think about Yogi as a manager?
He didn't like him as a manager. because he wasn't good old Yogi anymore. He wasn't the fun guy in the clubhouse, or at least the harmless guy in the clubhouse. And so, I think, Bouton liked it better when Ralph Houck was the manager and Berra was kind of a quasi coach or a coach. I don't think he took to Yogi's trying to parade himself as the manager of the New York Yankees circa the mid 60s.
Bouton, of course, was a Yankee for most of his career before, the end when he ended up with the Pilots and the Astros. A lot of guys, and I think Billy Martin, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, is probably one of them, took great pride in being a Yankee, even if they weren't the stars, the Yogi Berras and the Mickey Mantles. What was Jim Bouton's thoughts about being a Yankee? Is it something that he was proud of? Did he feel like he was part of that tradition? How did he think about that?
Well, when he was a kid, he was a Giants fan. He wasn't a Yankees fan. He said the Yankees fans grew up in a different neighborhood than the neighborhood he grew up in. But, for as much as he always said that he didn't have this reverence for the Yankees, he really did. I mean, when he described what it was like to walk into the Yankee clubhouse for the first time in 1962, I mean, he was awestruck. And I don't think he would have felt that way if he was walking into Calumet Stadium. I think it was because it was Yankee Stadium. And I think that once he may not have grown up a fan of the Yankees, but once he became a member of the Yankees, he was impressed by that. He liked that. I mean, that was the Rolls Royce of professional sports teams in America. And that's not something that he missed. I mean, he was aware of cultural significance, and he was aware that this was a team, if you were going to be in the major leagues, you wanted to be on the Yankees, even if you were a Giants fan growing up. So yeah, he had a measure of reverence. And I'll just say one more thing. He always liked to say that he didn't care that he was a Yankee. But I'll say this, that for many years after he retired, he had Pilots jerseys and uniforms and Astros jerseys and uniforms up in his attic. He would never take those out. He would take out the Yankee jersey, though, and he'd get into the full uniform every once in a while. And so that right there tells you that he viewed the Yankees as something different than the Astros or the Pilots.
Dale Tafoya, let's bring you in here for a minute. You wrote a book about Billy Martin and specifically his years as the manager of the A's in 1980 to 82. But I want to talk about him a little bit as a Yankee too, because we've been talking with the Yankees of that era with Berra, with Bouton at the end. Billy Martin, of course, was a Yankee player and later Yankee manager, and sort of kind of comically almost, Yogi Berra replaced Billy Martin as manager of the Yankees, and then was replaced by Billy Martin as manager of the Yankees. And I talked to Jon Pessah about this when we did the podcast, and maybe you can get into this a little bit too about Yogi's resentment towards the Yankees and towards George Steinbrenner for many years after because of the way he was fired. What kind of relationship did Billy Martin and Yogi Berra have?
I didn't get too much into Billy Martin and Yogi Berra's relationship. I do know some people are addicted to sex. Some people are addicted to drugs. Billy Martin was addicted to the Yankees. And that's pretty much how it even when he, as you mentioned, I wrote a book about him managing the A's. Of course, that was his homecoming, but he always had a romance with the Yankees.
Billy Martin was a guy who, especially in that era you write about with the A's, he really in some ways was the star of the team. I mean, Rickey Henderson was on that team, but he was quite young. Billy Martin was. You talked about how the marketing campaign for the A's was based around Billy Martin. And sort of what I was talking about earlier with we don't have iconic players anymore. We don't really have iconic managers anymore. What was it about Billy Martin or Earl Weaver, the guys from that era, that made them so compelling to fans in a way that we just don't see anymore?
Yeah, great question, Justin. And that's what makes Billy Martin such a character of the game, because as you mentioned, Earl Weaver as well, he would not only bring wins to a team and to a city, he was a drawing card. And everywhere he went, he drew fans. And as I talk about in my book, in 1979, the A's drew less than 307,000. By 1982, the A's drew over 1.7 million. He was just one of the characters of the game. He'd go out, kick dirt on an umpire. Fans couldn't wait till he came out, and just one of the entertaining characters of the game. And to this day, people I talk to in the book say baseball is missing that. The guy that's going to come out and entertain the players and be so unpredictable. And also players that play for Billy Martin, they loved when he went out there and argued to umpires because he was fighting for them. So just a character in the game. And owners like Calvin Griffith, they had to be careful when they fired Billy Martin because the fans would get pissed off and revolt and boycott and going to games. So and that's one thing doing all this research about Billy. It wasn't just about the wins; he was a drawing card, and owners knew that when they brought him in to manage the team.
Jason, you wrote about the 81 Dodgers, and they also had a manager who was kind of iconic in Tommy Lasorda, another guy who kind of became a celebrity outside the world of baseball. Similar question for him. What was it? He was a different kind of character than Billy Martin, but he was still a guy who got a lot of media attention and seemed to love it. Talk about Tommy Lasorda as an icon of baseball. Why was he such a compelling figure?
Absolutely. Before I even get into that, I will say, as a kid growing up in the Bay Area during the Billy Martin years, the A's staged marketing campaigns around Martin's tempestuous nature. I mean, I remember reading full-page advertisements featuring Martin kicking dirt on umpires in various permutations. Like they played it up, and the fans, including myself, loved it. Tommy Lasorda was a different kind of fiery. I think he was just as fiery as Billy Martin. He wasn't going to punch out his players in any kind of bars. And he had their backs, but he also had this unyielding thirst for attention. He wanted to be the center of everything. He was the perfect manager at the perfect time to be in Los Angeles. I mean, that is really when the Dodgers opened up as a media market. And when Lasorda took over for Walter Alston, who was, as stoic as managers got, it became a nightclub in the Dodger Stadium home clubhouse. Celebrities in Lasorda's office every single day. He loved showing off his players to the celebrities, and he loved showing off the celebrities to his players. That was, that was the coin of his realm. He fed off it. He went so far as to dress up Don Rickles in a uniform one day. And the story Rickles liked to tell was Lasorda actually had him go out to make a pitching change. What manager does that? Well, Tommy Lasorda did. He didn't actually make a pitching change. He just went out to talk to a struggling pitcher, who was nonetheless very confused by what was happening. But that was the kind of guy he was. Even as a third base coach under Walter Alston, he got more ink than the manager, and that was the way he loved it.
Self-promoter.
Yeah, you mentioned Walter Alston, and it seems like he is much more the model for the modern manager than Tommy Lasorda is, right? The kind of the company man who doesn't say much, doesn't say anything controversial. That seems to be what managers are in 2020, much more so than the Billy Martin, Tommy Lasorda model.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, one big difference was Walter Alston worked, I think, for 23 years on a string of one-year contracts. He never had job security, and he never made a stink about it. And he was good enough to stick around, up until the last few years when he was kind of running on his reputation. Lasorda changed that too. I mean, the way he changed the culture of the game is ingrained and pretty profound. He started getting the big contracts. He started getting attention for the managers in ways that, at least his predecessors had never done.
Jason, your book, the subtitle, of course, starts with Fernandomania, and Fernando Valenzuela was an icon in 1981, really a phenomenon that you rarely see in baseball, even certainly not now. And even then it was fairly rare. You had Mark Fidrich a few years before, and you have some other examples, but the kind of, the way he just burst upon the scene and again became a star immediately was kind of phenomenal. Take us back to that time a little bit, both in Los Angeles and just in the world at large. How big a celebrity was Fernando in 1981?
Man, Fernando, it wasn't just the size of his celebrity, it was the quickness with which he attained it. I mean, the guy wasn't even positive he was going to make the rotation going into the 1981 season, and all of a sudden a bunch of late-breaking injuries caused him to be the first rookie opening day pitcher in the 98-year history of the Dodgers. And what did he do? He threw a complete game shutout. And he threw another complete game in his next start, and he threw another shutout in his next start, and he threw another shutout in his next start, and he threw another shutout in his next start, by which time he was 5-0. And also that day, he went 3 for 4 to raise his season batting average to .438. Like, people were paying attention. I mean, he went 8-0 for his first 8 starts, 9 innings every time, 0.50 ERA. Right? That's a total of 4 runs in 72 innings. Baseball had not seen a start like it. He had this preternatural ability to know what was happening on the baseball diamond. He knew when to throw to second on a bunt attempt, a sacrifice attempt. He was picking off runners left and right. He could wield the bat. But really what put him over the top was kind of this mystery, right? And in one sense, he was this physical curiosity. He was overweight. His belly flopped over his belt. He had this unique hitch in his delivery where he looked skyward before he pitched. He was left-handed. He threw a screwball, of all things. That part was wild. Then he was this character who came from the dusty plains of Mexico, spoke almost no English. Very few people could communicate with him. He had no real interest in communicating. To this day, he has no interest in communicating, which is odd considering he's a broadcaster now. And people just couldn't get it. They just wanted more and more from him. And where it really mattered was the fact that the Dodgers, for the duration of their history in Los Angeles, since they arrived in 1958, but especially since Dodger Stadium opened in 1962, could not attract a Mexican fan base the way they wanted, despite some excellent efforts toward reaching that fan base. There were a higher concentration of Mexicans living in Los Angeles County at that time than anywhere in the entire world outside of Mexico City. And Walter O'Malley and Al Campanis were fond of saying they wanted to find a Mexican Sandy Koufax, somebody to activate the local Mexican community the way that Koufax had activated the Jews, and they couldn't do it. Like they fielded a handful of Mexican players, none of whom were very good, all of whom washed out quickly. It wasn't until Fernando came along that the grandstand at Dodger Stadium began to resemble a mariachi party. And it really hasn't let up. I mean, the local Mexican fan base is one of the Dodgers' strongest to this day.
Yeah, I was going to just ask you briefly about that because a lot of us, I think might think of Fernando Valenzuela as a phenomenon of 1981. Of course, he had a good career after that. But I think what I find when I talk to Dodgers fans a lot of times is he's still quite popular with the Dodgers, right? He's still an icon among Dodgers fans.
He is. I mean, he's still in Los Angeles. He never left. He's at Dodger Stadium, virtually every home game, and he calls the games on radio and for Spanish language radio. He's a very shy guy. He's reticent to speak publicly. And so it's a very different kind of celebrity than Lasorda engendered. I mean, Lasorda never met a microphone he didn't want to grab, and Lasorda and Fernando ran away from every microphone that was put in front of him. And yet that might be part of his appeal, and he's beloved.
John Shea, let's go back to you. We've been talking a lot about New York and Yogi Berra and the Yankees in the 50s. Of course, really started his career with the Giants in New York in the 50s. But shortly thereafter, not too long into his career, they moved to San Francisco. And one of the things that's interesting, again, and I think a lot of people maybe who aren't from San Francisco or aren't familiar with Willie Mays' story that much might not realize is that, at least in the early years there, he was never as embraced in San Francisco as he was nationwide, right? The fans in San Francisco didn't necessarily take to him the way you think they might take to this superstar in their midst.
Well, it's the oddest thing. If you go by the Giants facility now, it's 24 Willie Mays Plaza, and the first statue you see is of Willie Mays, and the right field wall is about 24 feet high. And San Francisco is all about Mays. There's a cable car, 24, named in Willie Mays' honor. But when he showed up in 1958, this was Joe DiMaggio's territory, Yogi Berra's old pal. And there was no getting around that for a lot of people. The old timers from North Beach or the Bay Area in general thought DiMaggio was it as a center fielder. And here comes this guy, Mays. Yeah, he's the best player in the game. He's the most entertaining player in the game, but he's not Joe D. And here Willie Mays shows up playing in DiMaggio's town and in Seal Stadium, which was DiMaggio's field, and he played DiMaggio's position. So it took a while, believe it or not, for the great Mays to be fully accepted in San Francisco. And maybe not until 1962 when he led the Giants to the pennant and had a great final month and went wild in the best of three series against the Dodgers that would determine who would play the Yankees in the World Series. Did he actually fully get appreciated? And I talked to some old timers, Eddie Montague, the son of the scout who signed Willie, Gary Hughes, the famous scout who grew up in the Bay Area, went to a bunch of games at Seal Stadium before the Giants showed up to watch the old Seals of the Pacific Coast League. And they adored Willie, but they admitted some people didn't. And it was just the strangest thing. And on top of that, he's a black man. And yeah, you can say all you want about San Francisco, but in December of '57, when he tried to buy a house, he couldn't. He picked out this house in a white neighborhood that overlooked the water, and it was a huge black eye and embarrassment to the city of San Francisco. This story went national that Willie Mays couldn't buy a house in a neighborhood in San Francisco. The great Mays, the heart of the team, the big celebration and parade that the team had with Mays coming to San Francisco, the Giants coming to San Francisco. But it was, it turned out that the next day Mays fought it and wouldn't let it go. And, one reason he fought it was not just because of him, but for the next guy, the next family, the next minority, and his kids or her kids to come in, made it easier. And that's what Willie was about in a lot of ways, kind of uniting at a time when people wanted to distance. And, he got his house, he fought for his house. And unfortunately, about a year later, someone threw a racist note in through the window in a Coke bottle. And he eventually moved. But like I said, he went over the city and wouldn't let the bigots win. And, many bigots at the time, the racists at the time, they rooted for Mays, and then they went home and looked in the mirror and said, what an idiot I am. What the heck am I doing? I'm rooting for this guy, but I'm a racist. So, Bill Clinton and a lot of the people I speak with talked about the indelible images of Mays throughout the years. He didn't speak out like Jackie or even Hank later in life, but he fought racism on his terms and usually won.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that a little bit too, because you read the book about how Jackie Robinson in the early 60s during the height of the civil rights movement was kind of critical of Willie Mays for not being more vocal, not being more of an activist. And of course, this is something we've heard in recent years about Michael Jordan, and we now are living in an era, in a time where race is at the forefront of all of our minds right now, and we see a lot of athletes are speaking out across all sports. Talk about that a little bit. About was he hurt by Jackie Robinson's criticisms? Were they fair criticisms?
I didn't know any better, and I thought they were because I never researched it until now. But in 1964, Jackie wrote an oral history of baseball and got a lot of ball players at the time to weigh in, black and white, about the history of integration in baseball and their journeys. And Mays wouldn't do it. Jackie is retired by now. Willie's in his prime. He's playing in San Francisco, but his dad always told him, hey, Junior, he called him Junior, cool it, because, you know, you just want to get in, you want to play ball. Now, you got to remember that Willie came from outside of Birmingham, and Martin Luther King called it the most segregated city in the country. And, you know, Jackie went to UCLA, he married Rachel, he played in the Negro Leagues, he was in the military. He didn't get to the Dodgers till his late 20s. And here's Willie Mays at 20 playing center field at the Polo Grounds. So different life story, different background. So it took Mays quite a while to do the things. And by the way, Willie adored Jackie and thought he was the perfect guy. He adored Monty Irvin. Monty Irvin could have been Jackie. That's another story. But yeah, it did hurt him. And Jackie in the book said, it's too bad Willie could be doing more for the African-American cause. So I looked into that, and I talked to Joe Morgan and Reggie Jackson and Maury Wills and Frank Robinson and even Hank Aaron, who's 3 years younger, Bob Kendrick over at the Negro League Museum in Kansas City, even Bill Clinton, who was influential in the civil rights movement in the 60s, who said Willie Mays made it absurd to be a racist, which is a powerful line. And he, like I said, talked about those images and those lasting moments that you see. And he led by example, and he called guys aside, like Morgan and these guys, telling me all these anecdotes about how Willie pulled me aside and told me to leave the game better than I found it, and what's my role, and not just that, because Willie learned from Monty Irvin and his dad and his older teammates with the Negro Leagues, and he tried to be a role model for the next generation and wanted Morgan and Jackson and Wills and all these guys to hand it down to the next generation, so that what Willie taught behind the scenes or in private would be handed down, you know, to the next guy. So that was, you know, he, like I said, he fought racism on his terms, and that's just another example. But, you know, he although it hurt, those words that Jackie said about Willie, he never stopped adoring him and thinking that he was the perfect guy to break the color barrier, just 4 years before Willie showed up.
Jon Pessah, let's talk about a little bit about Yogi again. He was a guy who died, I think in his 90s, and was this beloved figure. And, you know, Mitchell had mentioned a little bit earlier that maybe his reputation was different than the actual Yogi Berra. What did Yogi Berra think about his iconic stats later life? What did he think about the fact that he was beloved and that he was famous? Did he enjoy that? Like some people like that kind of thing, some people don't. What did Yogi think about being a living icon?
Well, Yogi certainly, you know, in the last 20, 30 years of his life, enjoyed the status that he had. But going back to the beginning, and talking about racism, one of the things that I was very surprised about when I started doing the research on this book was how much discrimination there was against Italian Americans in this country, and especially in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and how much discrimination Yogi felt because he was an Italian American. In fact, his first manager in baseball, 1943, in Class C ball in Norfolk, a guy named Shecky Kane, Berra was being ridden hard by the fans in the Piedmont League, and both for his Italian heritage and also for his looks. And he would see Yogi, and this is something that people didn't see from Berra, and this is why, that Berra would go back, as Mickey Mantle did for almost his entire career, and slam the bat into the bat rack and turn beet red and start cursing. And he grabbed Berra and said, "Look, you're really good. You're going to get a lot of abuse, especially because you're Italian. And if you let the fans know it, they're just going to get on you that much more. So what you really need to do is just let it at least appear that it's rolling off your back. And for his entire career, Yogi was mocked for his looks, for his supposed lack of intelligence. People, his teammates and opponents alike, called him the ape, Quasimodo, Nature Boy, which was a title of a column by Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist at the New York Times. And he just kept it all inside. And the thing that really kind of tips you off is he wrote two autobiographies, and the first one came out in 1961, written by a sports writer named Ed Fitzgerald, who went over to Simon & Schuster to be an editor. And the very first paragraph that Yogi wrote was about this strange, dumb athlete who was too dumb to feel pressure, which is why he got a home run in every situation, and about how dumb he looked and how dumb he sounded. And he said, "I don't know that person." It was the first paragraph he wrote when he was 35 years old in his book. So, for all those years that he was playing, and it came up again when he was managing, Yogi really resented the way people looked at him. And it's amazing to me that he came through all of that as a not bitter and as a normal person. And in the last 20, 30 years of his life, he ended up being celebrated as an American icon, and he was absolutely as approachable and as a normal person as you would find.
Mitchell, the Jim Bouton, of course, played in the 60s and early 70s at a time when the civil rights movement was at its hottest, at the forefront of American life. He was a white man, though, playing in baseball. Did he have much? We know that he was a guy who his attitudes about the baseball establishment. Did he have much to say, either in ball four or just in his private life, about race and baseball and the way that black players were treated, and the segregation that was in spring training early in his career, that sort of thing? Did he have much to say about that?
Well, I mean, he was attuned to it. I mean, he was involved in the 1968 proposed boycott of the Mexico City Olympics because South Africa had fielded a team, and so he was really one of the few white baseball players who was involved in that. In terms of baseball, he some of the notes that he took during the 1969 season deal with race, and the way that black players are treated differently than white players, and that less is expected. Well, not less is expected, but less is. People have different expectations for white ball players and black ball players, and when a black ball player tried to step out of that role that was created for him by somebody else, he would get a lot of pushback. And so, yeah, there is a fair amount of that in his notes, the notes that he wrote in the back of the barf bags and things like that. Not a lot of that comes through in ball four, but it's certainly there. It's certainly something that he was attuned to. One of the stories he told me was back when he was living in Illinois or Indiana, and he was going to school in Chicago Heights. He would work summers for the Parks and Rec Association, putting on organizing softball, basketball games, and he was amazed by the differences between the white kids and the black kids and their life experiences and how they were treated and how they viewed the world. He would come back after a day of refereeing or whatever he was doing, and he would tell his parents that it's a very different world out there depending on what the color of your skin is. I mean, he grew up in Lily White Ridgewood, New Jersey, which was not the most diverse area. When he got to Chicago Heights, it was different, and so yeah, he was aware of it. He talked about it. he would speak out about it when asked. But, you know, in the mid-'60s, not too many people were asking. I don't think too many people wanted to hear about it. And so that's why you see a lot of those things in the notes that don't really end up so much in the book.
We talked about Yogi Berra the last, 20, 30 years of his life sort of was an icon, and Willie Mays certainly has been an icon in his for his whole life since he started playing pretty much, but certainly in his retirement years, he's been feted by presidents and everybody loves him. And same with Yogi. Jim Bouton had, obviously was a different kind of player, different kind of person, but it seems to me that there was, a lot of people really did develop a respect for Jim Bouton later in his life, and maybe in ways that some people didn't after Ball 4 came out. What was his feeling about his place in the baseball world when he was kind of an elder statesman?
Well, he always felt that he was the guy who was always asked to comment whenever something went wrong in baseball. And after a while, he didn't like that. He felt that he was the go-to guy whenever something happened. Like, so when there was the steroid era, his phone would ring off the hook, and he'd be asked to talk about, well, how is that like greenies or not like greenies or things like that. Players sleeping around, he would be asked about those things. So he kind of felt that was a role that was imposed upon him, and sometimes he was okay with it, but a lot of times he wouldn't take those calls just because he didn't want to be pigeonholed as that guy, as the guy who was the ultimate iconoclast, who was now going to pass judgment on every other transgression or alleged transgression in baseball history that had taken place since he played.
Right.
And so that was an interesting thing to me when he would talk about that, because he was interested in those things. But I think he also felt that he could become trapped by those things. And so he kind of walked a fine line in that regard, so that he didn't become overly exposed at that one area.
This question is really for Dale or Jason. You can both address it because you both wrote about the A's. Jason, you wrote about the A's of the mid 70s, and Dale, you wrote about the A's of the late 70s, early 80s. Jason, you had mentioned to me when we were exchanging emails that Charlie Finley, who of course was the owner of the A's for many years and was, again, the kind of thing we don't see anymore. He was like a celebrity owner. We talked about we don't really see celebrity players and managers. We don't really see the celebrity owners in baseball so much anymore. But Charlie Finley certainly was that. Even before George Steinbrenner, before Ted Turner, any of those guys, you had Finley. Finley, Jason, you talked about this a little bit. Finley, you said, wanted to hire Billy Martin well before he actually did, when the A's were winning all those championships, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Martin had a little bit of a pedigree then. He was Finley's kind of guy. He was feisty. He was a scrapper. And Dick Williams quit after 2 straight championships because he could not tolerate the thought of working for Charlie Finley for a 3rd straight season. Finley was just that meddlesome. And, I guess that's what it takes to be a celebrity owner, is you have to want that spotlight. And Finley inserted himself into every facet of the A's organization. At the height of their powers, the Swingin' A's had a front office consisting of 7 people because Finley wore so many of the hats. So he made overtures to Billy Martin early on in the early 70s, I believe before he ever worked for the Yankees. He called him. They agreed to terms over the phone. Martin said, well, why don't you send me some film of the team and a contract, and I'll get right to work and jump on board next season. Never got the film. Never got a return phone call after that, and could never figure it out. And somewhere in the back rooms, Charlie Finley probably recognized that Billy Martin was too much of his own man, kind of too self-identified and hard-headed to take the meddling that Finley was sure to slather upon him, and just backed out quietly. And Martin never understood it until they finally came together years later at the very end of Finley's tenure. That was one of the last things Charlie Finley did was hire Billy Martin, who resurrected a dying franchise, almost single-handedly. And Dale can speak expertly to that.
Yeah,
That's a great.
we'll get to that in just a second. One thing I did want. I'm sorry, just let me mention one thing. Jason, you mentioned that Finley recognized that Billy Martin and he both had maybe too big an ego to exist. That's something that George Steinbrenner never really recognized, though, because that's exactly the dynamic that played out with those two time and time again. It's kind of fascinating to look at that it could have happened with Charlie Finley before it ever happened with Steinbrenner. But yeah, Dale, talk about how it actually ended up happening that as Finley's getting ready to sell the A's after free agency, and he's no longer in a position to dominate the American League because he's not going to pay for the players. How does it happen that Billy Martin comes to manage the A's at that point?
Right. I want to go back to what Jason said about when Dick Williams resigned from the A's in the early 70s. Steinbrenner signed Dick Williams after that, but because Williams is still under contract with Finley stopped that. So when Billy was available to Finley in 1980, Billy Martin was still under contract with Steinbrenner. So Steinbrenner wanted to play hardball with Finley because they were in the same situation in reverse roles from the early 70s. So yeah, just Billy Martin had just gotten fired by the Yankees after he punched out a marshmallow salesman in October of 1979. And he was available, and Charlie Finley had just fired Jim Marshall a week before, and he ended up signing Billy Martin at the Drake Hotel in Chicago because he didn't extend his California business license, so he had the press conference had to take place in Chicago, and yeah, Billy came in, and when we talk about Billy Martin, I just want to emphasize he always made an impact everywhere he went, in every city he went, and he did the same thing in Oakland, and the A's were an upstart team. They had Ricky Henderson, Dwayne Murphy, Tony Armas, but there was just this mental confidence that Billy brought to these young players, these players, Justin, that were used to playing in front of 1,000, 1,500 people at the Oakland Coliseum. He made them believe in themselves, and he resurrected the A's, and they finished in second place in 1980, and by 1981, in that strike-shortened season, they ended up going all the way to the ALCS. Of course, they were swept by the Yankees in the ALCS, but it was a nice resurrection under Billy Martin, and he really just rescued and just brought life to the Oakland Coliseum, the city of Oakland, and that's the thing about Billy Martin. What makes him special, he could not only bring wins to a team, he could shake an entire city. It wouldn't last long, but that's just some of the things he could do. He just had tremendous impact and brought a lot of confidence to a team.
All right. Well, we're at right about an hour here, so this might be a good time to go to listener questions. I don't know, Brad, if you're there.
Yep, I'm here. Let me just turn my video back on. All right, so I'm going to try to scroll through here and get to some of your questions. So this, some of these are for a particular panelist. Some are for everybody. Let's start out with from Reddy wants to know. I don't know if that's Randy Reddy or just Reddy. One of our audience members wants to know, what is a completely unmarketable baseball book you would love to write, but probably never will get green lit? So let's start with Jason.
Good choice, Brad. Well, Brad and I have been talking for months about doing a podcast about the 1985 Giants, who lost 100 games and spurned a million headaches in the Bay Area. I don't think anyone would ever buy that book from a publishing standpoint. I think it will be a lot of fun to explore that book and see.
Amen. Never say never.
Yeah, it's true. When our podcast sings, we're gonna turn to you, Justin, for advice there. We'll see what the publishers say.
All right, Mitch.
Oh, geez, growing up a Phillies fan, most topics are unmarketable, other than Carlton. The thing is with all of these is that I find that unless you're writing about a New York person, most things are unmarketable. you know, or at least traditionally unmarketable. And I mean, that's a whole other topic, I guess. But I mean, what would I write about? I mean, it would have to be a Phillies topic, and it would have to be something other than the 1980 Phillies or the 2008 Phillies, which means all of it would be unmarketable. But I would be interested in it.
The 1988 Phillies. Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right, Jon Pessah.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to disagree with Mitch. Every time I pitch a New York player, I'm told that nobody else wants to read about New York players other than people in New York. And in all honesty, the two books that I would really love to write, and I can't get either one of them much interest, is Elston Howard, who had a terrific career for the Yankees, and Don Mattingly, who had a terrific career for the Yankees. And I'm not seeing a lot of interest in the publishing world in either one of those two books, but they interest me a great deal.
That shocks me that Don Mattingly would not have more traction, but let's go to Dale.
It shocked me as well.
Right. Yeah, I think that for me, two books that right off the top of my head that I'm interested in writing and probably won't get any hits on them is the 1984 Baseball Olympics, that 1984 team with Mark McGuire, Corey Snyder. That 84 team with, I think, Pete and Cavilla was just power-packed with all these future stars. And they eventually made their way into the big leagues in 1986, and just a talented crop of rookies. So it would be that 1984 USA Olympic team with all those stars, and also the 1985 Huntsville, Alabama team, the A's AAA, AA affiliate in 1985. They were loaded with talent: Canseco, Stan Javier, Terry Steinbach. They were one of the most talented minor league teams in the history. So it would be those two things: the 1985 Huntsville Stars and the 1984 Olympic team.
All right, and John Shea.
Well, instead of players or teams, I'm thinking something, a finer part of the game, like the art of the double play, which has always intrigued me. And I love watching pregame infield, which is rare, but spring training infield or any kind of infield, high school, college, whatever, because these guys work so hard and so long on the flip, the turn, the throw, the scoop, whether it's all-time double play tandems or just all-time storytelling. But that's just part of the game that I could always watch, and they practice forever, even though they might not ever get an opportunity to turn a double play on any given night.
Right. All right, let's stick with you, John. And this will go to all the panelists. Daryl Grigsby wants to know, of all the myriad topic, stories, eras, teams, personalities, etc. in baseball, why did you choose your particular topic for your new book?
I think it chose itself. I mean, it's looking at me right in my face. I'm working at the San Francisco Chronicle. I have access to the clubhouse, or at least I did, no longer. And Willie Mays, the icon that he is, shows up every day before home games, and you get a relationship, and boom, that's it. It just so it was like 15 years in the works, and I set aside any thoughts of doing any other books during that time just to do this. And I think it was worth it for me and Willie, because he was engaged throughout the whole process and absolutely loves the finished product. And that's really cool, because so many of his inner circle friends tell me that the quotes that appear, the presence of Willie throughout the book is exactly how Willie is. Willie talks. Willie, lives his life. So that was like the ultimate compliment. And obviously we're co-authors. So, are you kidding me? Who am I to be putting the ball on the tee for this man? But I enjoyed every moment of it.
All right, let's go to Mitch.
So what interested me about Bouton was that he has sort of these two competing auras about him. So on the one hand, he's this really measured, smart, well thought out guy. But on the other hand, he's the bulldog, a guy who's just a competitor to the nth degree. And, if you saw The Last Dance, like Michael Jordan is like that. Michael Jordan will rip your heart out. And to me, it was interesting. How is one guy both of those things? How is one guy just a really measured, well thought out guy, but at the same time, a guy who will rip your heart out on the field? And to me, I always thought that you could be one or the other. Bouton is both. And so I wanted to learn more about the guy who was both of those things. And I learned that he was both of those things in pretty much everything he did, which made him fascinating.
Okay, Jon Pessah?
I thought Yogi's persona almost obliterated his accomplishments on a baseball field. So I really wanted to go back and look at him as a baseball player. And also, I was familiar with all the abuse that he, or some of the abuse that he absorbed. And I knew him late in his life, and a lot of my friends knew him very well. And I wanted to understand how a man who was this famous and endured as much abuse as he did emerged with such an incredibly positive outlook on life. And that was just a fascinating journey for me.
Okay, Jason Turbow.
Well, I'll keep this brief. For me to write a book about a team and a season, it's got to meet a few criteria. One is the team has to be significant. Dodgers won the World Series in 1981. There have to be significant storylines, and we've got Fernandomania. We've got Lasorda's first championship. We've got the final season together of the storied infield, Garvey, Lopes, Russell, and Shea. And we have the strike all coming together to create this kind of wild brew for Los Angeles. And ultimately, the biggest factor is there can't have been another good book written on that team. And this Dodgers team was mercifully uncovered. So I took full advantage of that.
All right. And then Dale, and then I got a follow-up for you, Dale.
Okay, great. I would say I didn't set out to write a book about Billy Martin, but when I studied in the newspaper archive, that's where I get a lot of great ideas. And I saw how bad the A's were in the late 70s. And by 1982, the A's were under new ownership, and Baseball America made them tap them Organization of the Year. And as I studied that renaissance, Billy Martin was clearly the difference maker in this. And also, when I delved deeper, I started to realize the ties Billy Martin had to the Oakland area and to the A's. Even when he was a coach with the Twins, the third base coach, he was monitoring the Oakland Coliseum being built. And he was eyeing, first of all, Billy was very loyal to the American League. He was an American League guy. And he knew the Kansas City A's only was going to move them to Oakland. And he always had his eyes set on managing that American League team in Oakland. And eventually did in 1980.
And then Daniel Vandemortel said Billy Martin's handling of the George Brett pine tar bat was a classic. Anything comparable to that while he was with the A's, the ability to pull a rabbit out of the hat against an opponent?
Yeah, well, there's a story where Maury Wills was batting. I believe it happened in 1981, and I think in Seattle at the Kingdome, the batter's box was adjusted to give Maury Wills an advantage against Rick Langford or something like that. So Billy comes out before the game, tells the umpire, I believe Maury Wills got ejected or there's some type of fine. But Billy Martin, it was kind of the same concept what he did with George Brett. He constantly kept the opposing manager on their toes. He stressed opposing managers out, and he frustrated them so much. In May of 1980, after a game in Detroit, Billy Martin did all these hit and runs and double steals. And after the inning, Lance Parrish went into the visitors' dugout at the Coliseum and tore up the water fountain. And Jack Morris, after the inning, threw the ball into center field. I mean, he just had the ability to get into so many opposing managers' head. He just rattled opponents.
Right. Okay, for John Shea from Benjamin Klein, why do you think San Francisco embraces Willie McCovey more than Willie Mays?
I think it was pretty easy. Mays came from New York, and McCovey started his career in San Francisco. And it wasn't just McCovey, but it was Cepeda. The Giants' first year out west was 1958. And the Rookie of the Year, Cepeda. That was 58. 59, Rookie of the Year, McCovey. So these two young sluggers who happened to play the same position, which was quite confusing, just took the Bay Area by storm. They were the only team. And colorful ball players, great ball players, and everyone enjoyed watching these ball players. And they were buddies, did a lot of stuff off the field, went to the San Francisco club. So they made their mark not only on the field, but in the community. But Mays, he was the older guy. He was the established guy. And why would a San Franciscan, accept someone from New York, right? I mean, that was part of the deal too. So it was a strange dynamic that McCovey and Cepeda in some ways were more popular than the great Mays.
Thank you. Jon Pessah from Abbey, what can you say about Yogi's Mets legacy? What did you discover about that time period that isn't out there in the conventional understanding of the 72 to 75 seasons? Was Yogi the only choice to replace Gil Hodges, and when offered the role, did he have any reservations?
Well, let me go in reverse order. He was the only choice, and the Mets made the unfortunate decision to announce that Yogi was the manager on the same day that Gil Hodges was buried. Not a great public relations move at all. He did not have reservations, but his wife Carmen, his wife of 65 years, never wanted him to manage, and tried strongly to talk him out of managing the Mets. Her favorite years were the years that he coached the Mets before he became manager. She just loved the fact that no pressure. His intelligence wasn't being questioned, as every time he became manager, it was all over again. It was, for her, it was just a wonderful life. But Joe Garagiola also tried to talk him out of it. And after Yogi told him how much he really thought this team could win and how desperately he wanted to win a World Series, Joe talked to Carmen and convinced her that this was, this was something they had to let Yogi do. I think the thing that surprised me the most, there were two scenes. One, a very strained relationship with Tom Seaver, and that came up time and again during his time with the Mets. And when he was fired, he knew it was coming with the Mets, and he took a day off, and then he comes back to the clubhouse, and he goes around, he sits in Roy McMillan's office, now Roy McMillan's office, fields all the questions, goes out of his way to make Roy McMillan comfortable, and then goes into the locker room and thanks every single player for playing hard for him. And the entire team stopped to watch when he got to Seaver's locker, because Seaver was very public in lobbying for the Mets to fire Yogi. And he stood there, shook his hand, thanked him for getting them to the World Series in 73. And as he's walking out, Ed Kranepool, who's 30 years old but had been in the game for 10 years, turned to a writer and said, there goes one of the nicest men you'll ever meet in baseball, and he's just too nice to be a manager.
All right, back to Dale. Would Billy Martin have meshed well with the Bash Brothers, who you've also written a book about, and the late 1980s A's?
I would say so. Billy Martin was feisty. He in fact, he drafted Canseco, Billy Martin, and he hired a scout named Camilo Pascual, who played with him in Minnesota, and he brought him over as a scout in the 80s. And Pascual was moving around in Florida scouting for Billy. And in 1982, he drafted Canseco in June, I think the 15th round. But yeah, I think Billy brought confidence wherever he went, and I think he would he would have worked well with Canseco and McGuire.
All right. So we'll do a lightning round on this question real quick for each of you. Which part do you most enjoy, the research or the writing? Jason.
I really do enjoy both of them. I mean, I love delving into baseball history and esoterica and compiling it and organizing it. And I could easily find myself being a baseball historian, but I think for me, there's nothing like writing. I mean, like that's where I lose track of time, and I can look up and it's 6 hours later, and hopefully there's something adequate on the page when I'm done. So luckily they both appeal to me, but I love the writing process.
Mitch?
Definitely the writing. I mean, the research, you find nuggets and that's great, but the writing is just, to me, that's why I do it. So yeah, it's always going to come down to that.
Jon Pessah?
Love the research, and I love the writing when it's over.
Dale?
I love the research, and nothing better than to chase somebody down. You're trying to find somewhere in the country, and you know this, Brad, and them agreeing to an interview. And that's one of my favorite parts. I feel best after accomplishing that. So it would be your research.
Amen to that. John Shea?
Well, I love both, but the research is what I remember about this project, because I spent a week in Willie's hometown in Fairfield and visited the old ballpark he played in, which still stands, Rickwood Field, 1910, oldest professional ballpark still out there. Talking to Monty Irvin and Alvin Dark and Bill Clinton, George Bush, Hank Aaron, man, and Vinny Costas. I mean, it's like, holy, and again, who am I? But it's like, in my day job, when I leave 10 messages, I'm hoping 4 or 5 call back. But when I leave messages for these guys saying, hey, it's for a Mays book, I'm hitting like 1,000. So that part was incredible, just being able to write history, kind of write new history, because a lot of this stuff really hasn't been told by folks who have, lived their lives and, in retrospect, remember this stuff like it was yesterday.
Right. Jon Pessah, what kind of influence did D-Day have in Yogi's life?
I'll answer that by quoting his sister-in-law, who's still alive. She was one of Carmen's younger sisters, and I asked her what it was like in the 40s. She met Yogi in 1947 when Carmen did, and she said, if you were alive and you had a job, you were the happiest person in the world. This is a guy who at 18 saw people dying by the hundreds in front of him, and had the unfortunate experience of, when the battle was over, one of his tasks, his boat was to go through the English Channel and fish out the dead sailors. There was a scene when they opened up the Yogi Berra Museum in Montclair, New Jersey. A group of veterans came and presented him with a plaque. And they walked into the lobby, and Yogi comes walking out from inside the museum, and they met each other in the lobby, and they just all stood there. And before any one of them said a single word, they all just broke down crying. That all of these memories that they had of what they all went through, which they had worked so hard to keep submerged because they were just so awful, just all came forward. And I think that gave him such an unbelievable appreciation of life, that no matter what happened to him, he was always just happy to be alive.
Right. All right, 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. For Dale, is the ability to rattle an opponent's cage the same thing as being a great motivator? In other words, was Billy Martin as great a motivator as he was an agitator?
It's a good question. And Billy Martin was a motivator. He knew how to motivate players, whether it be to compliment them, piss them off, have another coach piss them off, Billy Martin, and he learned this from Casey Stengel. Billy Martin read a lot of psychology books and a lot of psychology magazines about how to lead men. And Billy Martin was definitely a motivator. And some players who he didn't help don't speak highly of him and don't like him because maybe he didn't start them, or maybe he cut them and they have some bad memories of that. But he definitely took pride in leading men, and his leadership wasn't by accident. He actually studied a lot of this psychology stuff to be an effective leader.
Right. And Turbo, we'll finish with you. Two-parter. What are your thoughts on the influence of the strike on the Dodgers championship? So do you think they actually would have won the World Series without the strike? And then how much has the working relationship changed between the owners and the players union from 1981 to now?
Oh, God.
Before I answer either of those questions, I just wanted to add to Dale's answer about Billy Martin. Your answer about catching Maury Wills in the batter's box in Seattle was a perfect answer. Wills was actually the manager of the Mariners at that point.
Okay, good.
And what struck me as wild, and a lot of the people there, was they couldn't believe that Martin noticed, that anyone noticed that there was a difference, and it was a full foot to help guard against the A's breaking ball pitchers, just like you said. That the guy was prepared, and that alone could motivate his players, to answer your previous question. To answer my question, yeah, boy, that strike influenced the Dodgers in huge ways, their success. I don't think they make the playoffs, let alone win the World Series. Right before the strike hit, their lead had dropped from something like 6.5 games to a half a game in the course of about a week. They were on a terrible losing streak. Had the strike hit even one day later, it would not have been surprising to think that they might not have made the playoffs at all, because by dint of being in first place when the strike hit, they were crowned first half champions. And that let them kind of coast through the second half in ways that benefited them. They got to heal up some of their players. They got to absorb some injuries. And then they got hot at exactly the right time. The Cincinnati Reds had the best record in the National League. They didn't make the playoffs at all. I think if there's no strike, it's the Reds, the Cardinals are right there. I don't think the Dodgers are anywhere close to the playoffs. So they got very, very lucky. And, one thing that the Dodgers benefited from in 1981 in terms of the strike, one thing all of baseball benefited from, was the Players Association. It started in 1972. Marvin Miller came on. He united a kind of a loosely knit band of players and gave that union more teeth than virtually any union in the country. And they dug in 1981, and Marvin Miller dug in, and he did not yield an inch. The owners were bucking back against free agency, which was still only about 5 years old at that point. And Marvin Miller wasn't going to give back anything he had earned for those players. And to this day, the Players Association is still very strong, and the owners continue to be terrified of it. And you can see what they did here. The owners tried to walk back the agreement that they made with the Players Association, a month or two ago, and the players weren't having any of it. It's a stout union, and I think that's ultimately of huge benefit to them.
All right. Well, I am going to close here with putting this up on the screen for everyone. I want to thank Justin for moderating and leading us here. Justin, do you want to say any closing words or direct people to your podcast?
No, just thanks everybody for listening tonight. Thanks to all the panelists. If you're not familiar with Baseball by the Book, you can find it on all the major podcast applications, Apple Podcasts, I'm drawing a blank on all the different names right now. Spotify, all the other apps, you can find it. And you can find us on Facebook and on Twitter as well, at Baseball Book Podcast at Baseball Book Pod on Twitter, and just go to Facebook and you can search for Baseball by the Book and you'll find us.
I want to thank all of our panelists tonight, all members of the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. They all have books that have just come out. So please, if you haven't picked up their books yet, you can go through our website, which is on your screen, and order it through Bookshop, which supports independent local bookstores. We also have a lot of exciting developments coming up through the club. We have a continued series of panels. So some of you have made suggestions in the chat that we're actually already in the process of putting together. We'll be having a women in baseball panel. And we had several other suggestions. A panel on the writing process, which we're going to put out there. We also have a podcast, which has the audio from many of our one-on-one interviews that we do. So stay tuned. Check out our website or on Twitter. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us.